Hello and welcome to the Digital Publishing Podcast, Episode 8, Barrier Busters and AI Washing Machines. In this episode, I'm joined by Simon Holt, Senior Product Manager for Content Accessibility at Elsevier. We talk accessible content, accessible employment, AI, and much more. This is a really great conversation. Enjoy. Simon, thank you so much for joining me on this beautiful sunny afternoon. It feels strange saying my own name, but hello, good to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm good. I mean, hey, it's a great name, right?
Apparently, yeah. All the best digital accessibility people.
Or at least some of them. Yeah.
Yes, some of them. Some. Brilliant. Well, how are you getting on?
Doing well, thank you. Really happy to be here and following in the footsteps of the other illustrious names that you've had in the series so far.
Yeah, I've been very lucky to have some fantastic guests in the 8 episodes until now, and very pleased to welcome you to this esteemed hall. For those who don't know you out there, could you maybe just introduce yourself and tell us what you currently do?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Simon. I live in Oxford in the UK, and I work with Elsevier, where I'm currently the Senior Product Manager for Content Accessibility. So in English, that means that I lead our efforts to help make our books and journals and audio and video more accessible to readers and authors with various types of disabilities, because I believe quite strongly that knowledge is for everybody, science is for everybody, and publishing is for everybody as well.
Absolutely, and you're in lots of sort of industry groups, and you're very present in the conversation around all of these topics.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things I really like about working in the kind of accessibility field is that it's a very collaborative field, right? I'm really proud of the work that Elsevier has done and is doing in the field, but for me it's not about saying, one publisher is better than another. Actually, as a reader or as an author, we want all publishers to be to have accessible content, right?
Yeah.
And so that means that it's about sharing knowledge. It's about learning from other people. I've learned a tremendous amount from our colleagues at lots of different publishers, right? Whether that's metadata from our friends at McGraw-Hill, or it's the great work that Taylor and Francis are doing, or indeed about the work that Springer are doing as well. So, really, I think I really like the fact that we're part of a community in terms of publishing accessibility, and that's very important to me. So I'm involved with various industry organizations. So some of those are to do with accessibility, such as the Publishing Accessibility Action Group, which obviously, Simon, you're a big part of, and Federation of European Publishers Accessibility Working Group, but also more broadly than that, I'm a director of the Society for Scholarly Publishing, and I'm quite involved as well with other organisations like ALPS, because I think when we think about things like accessibility and disability inclusion, they're not separate from what we do as publishers and in the publishing industry, but right. Indeed they're an integral part of that. And so actually when we have conversations about things like broader publishing topics, whether we're talking about research integrity, or we're talking about open access, or we're talking about production workflows, actually accessibility, not just in terms of when we think about how we make our content and our platforms accessible, but also who has not just access to them, but who gets to participate in the industry, I think is all part of that. And so that's why I feel that my remit is really to be as part of as many of these conversations as possible, really.
Right. Brilliant. And we will talk a bit more later about that distinction between content accessibility and accessible careers, access to the publishing industry. But I thought before that, let's go all the way back in terms of your career. And I'll just ask you, how did you get started? How did you end up here?
Well, how did we get here, right? I think there's a famous song that has that in it, right? So for me, I'm a visually impaired person. I think that's probably the most important and the first thing to say. when we're thinking about my career. And the reason that that's important is because the first thing that I learned when I left university, so like lots of people, I did a humanities degree at university, and the first thing that I learned was that when I left university, so this would have been 2007, 74% of people in the UK who were visually impaired of working age were unemployed. So when a lot of my peer group were kind of thinking, well, what career should I go into? I want to be a director of this, or I want to change that, or I want to really lead in this. Success for me was having a job. Pure and simple. I just thought, can I find somebody who is going to pay me a wage? And that really affected me in that I thought, well, actually, I don't think this is really good enough. I feel that people like us, so vision impaired people or disabled people in general, should aim higher than that. Just having a job, I don't think is enough as a career aspiration, right? There's no way that we shouldn't be able to aspire to the kinds of careers that other graduates have. And so for me, my first job was I worked for an organisation called the History Press, who do kind of tourist books, right? If you go to a town in the Cotswolds and you want to buy a book that's 100 images of this town 100 years ago, that kind of book is the kind of book that we publish. And that was a great start because at a small publisher you get to do everything. But what I also realised was that actually being a vision impaired person, especially around the time of the financial crash, the kinds of protections that I might need weren't available to me. And the kinds of opportunities and the kind of accommodations that I might need weren't available either. So I decided to go and do a master's in publishing because I felt I had to be better qualified than other people in order to get the same job. So I did that, and many job interviews, many of which involved tasks that I wouldn't say were particularly suitable for a vision impaired person, like proofreading tests for jobs that didn't involve proofreading. I finally got a job at Routledge, and I had 4 very happy years at Routledge. But again, I wanted to move on to the next level, and I felt, I can't say that anybody said this to me, but I felt there was maybe a feeling that, there was some things that I might find a bit more difficult, travel and what have you, because of my vision. And therefore I was finding I was going for jobs, but I wasn't quite getting them. And I just started to get to the impression that for whatever reason, it might have been disability related, it might have had nothing to do with my disability, they didn't see me being able to reach the next level. So I was approached on LinkedIn by somebody from Elsevier, and they said, would you come for an interview? So I went for an interview, and I've always been very open about being visually impaired in job applications, because I feel that if an employer isn't willing or able to work with me regarding that and provide accommodations and work together to solve problems, then not only am I not going to be able to reach my potential, but also they're not going to be the right manager for me. And this manager who interviewed me at Elsevier, I explained that I was visually impaired as part of the interview, and she said, "Oh, my daughter's visually impaired." And that was the single most important moment in my career, because for the first time I had a manager. So, I got the job and I had a manager who understood what it was to be visually impaired.
Right.
And she fought for me. And because she fought for me and she believed in me, I started to believe in me really for the first time. And I started to be able to show what I could do. And for the first time, I felt that my career started to be defined by what I could do as opposed to what I couldn't do. But what it also made me feel was, wow, I got such a lucky break. But I don't want people in the publishing industry, or indeed any industry, to have to rely on luck in order to progress, right? I think it's really important that we really take this seriously. So what my career is about really is trying to create opportunities, both in terms of readers and authors, but also employees, to try and fulfill their potential in our industry. We do great work, and I feel that actually by being more accessible and more disability inclusive, we as an industry can help fulfill our potential as well as helping individuals fulfill theirs. So I've spent most of my career in in the editorial space, right? So commissioning books, science and technology books, so working in areas like nanotechnology, and then running journals as well in areas like microbiology. And then about 18 months ago, I got asked, because of the campaigning that I was doing, maybe in the disability inclusion space, where I'd set up Elsevier Enabled, Elsevier's Disability Inclusion Staff Network, and become a campaigner for disability inclusion in the industry. But also because of my editorial experience, especially in books, whether I would help lead Elsevier's response to the EAA and look at content accessibility more broadly. And so I think where I've landed is probably a really good fit for me, because it obviously allows me to work in an area that's important to me because of my personal circumstances, right? But also use my professional expertise in terms of the things you do when you work in commissioning, right? Build relationships, sell a vision, and also work on some of our book products and journal products, which obviously are quite familiar to me, given the work that I've done in my career to date.
So, I mean, you talked very nobly there about sort of aspirations for things that would help. What are some of the things that would really help other people to not have to rely on luck? Because luck is not equally distributed, of course. So what are some things that would really count, in your opinion?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the first thing to think about here is that according to the UN, 15% of the world's working age population has a disability, right? So that's over 1 billion people worldwide. When you include neurodivergent people, then we're looking at over 20%. And so, this means that if you don't have a disability yourself, then somebody definitely will. And so when we're thinking about this, we need to stop thinking about this on an individual basis, although obviously the needs of each person are different, and really start thinking about this from a systemic point of view. So, when we think about the employee life cycle, right? So everything from, attract, hire, onboard, develop, promote, right? When we think of each stage of that, we need to think what barriers are faced by people with disabilities and how can we remove them. So, in every communication, when somebody's applying for a job, ask them, do you need an accommodation? What might that be? Think about your job ads themselves even. Make sure it includes language actively saying that we welcome people from different types of backgrounds, including disability, because if you're not actively including, then you're probably accidentally excluding, right? When you're thinking about hiring somebody, right, what processes are there for a manager to say, okay, I want to hire somebody with X or Y disability. What support can I get to make sure that they can get the help they need, as in the new employee, but also the manager? Because when you're a busy manager, so that's any manager, and you have two candidates who are maybe about the same, ability-wise, if one can hit the ground running straight away, but the other one, you might, they might have more potential, but they need quite a lot of help in order to be able to do the job. If you're busy and overworked, it's so easy to go for the person who can hit the ground running straight away. So we need to make it easier to make those more inclusive choices, right? And that means making sure the manager knows that they can talk with somebody in HR, perhaps, who can say, fine, I will help you have a conversation with the person you want to hire to think about what those accommodations might be. Also, then when they get into the job, think about what the accommodations process might be. So, for me, for example, when I first started, at the time Elsevier didn't have anything like that, so I use a screen reader. I didn't get a screen reader for several weeks, and that meant that I couldn't do my job properly in those first crucial weeks. I'm glad to say that that's changed now, but actually if we think about somebody's first weeks, they're often the most important weeks of their kind of career or their performance in that job, because that's where they're doing the most learning. Well, obviously if you can't access the materials, you're not doing much learning. And then similarly, when we're looking at promotion, it's about, okay, let's think about what does the next level involve and how can we mitigate that, right? So, if there are things, so for me, for example, right, if there's a job that involves driving, well, clearly I'm never going to be able to drive. But if the job involves travel, well, what other options do we have? So I don't have to drive. There are taxis, you can have lots of video calls these days. And I think when I see somebody with a disability, I see somebody who's a good problem solver, right? Because we have to solve problems in our everyday in order to lead an independent, fulfilling life. We have to be adaptable. We might have to be good at building relationships because we need to ask for help. These are all qualities that will help you solve your business problems as well. And so therefore, it's so easy just to say, right, well, we want people who will do things the way they're always done. But the reason that diversity and inclusion are important is because actually businesses that make diverse perspectives, showcase diverse perspectives, tend to make better business decisions. And if you're serious about making and taking into account diverse perspectives, then clearly disability inclusion needs to be part of the equation. And so for me, what I want people to see when they see me is somebody who maybe goes about things in a different way, thinks about things from a different point of view, is able to enact transformational change. And I always say anything that I've achieved, isn't despite having a disability. It's because I have a disability and the skills I've learned along the way. And that's what I want people to take when they're thinking about hiring other people with disabilities too. We are not a community to be pitied. In fact, we're a community that will make you as a business stronger. And I feel that message is actually really important, not in terms of just individuals fulfilling their potential, but helping organizations to become stronger, better, more innovative as well.
Yeah. And in terms of accessible employment, as well as perhaps content accessibility and awareness, do you think that things are moving in the right direction? Do you get a sense that the industry is improving or improving fast enough?
Yeah, I think so. My mantra, and sorry if this sounds a bit cheesy, but my mantra is change happens one conversation at a time, right? There isn't a magic bullet where, suddenly we wake up and everything's inclusive, or, we're completely disability confident. But actually it's about having hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations like this. And it's about showing that actually by employing more diverse kinds of people, however you want to think about diverse, we have better outcomes. And so it's about normalizing conversations around disability. When I started at Elsevier, so this is 11 years ago, for the longest time I felt I was the only person with a disability. But by coming together, as I mentioned, I started the staff network. Suddenly there were 5 of us, then there were 10 of us, then there were 50 of us. Now there's about 250 of us. Now, I'm not saying that covers everybody who has a disability in Elsevier. I really hope it doesn't, given we have about 8,000 people in the organisation. But what it does is that it shows actually this is a population that has representation across the industry. Actually, these are people who are contributing a lot to not just Elsevier, but all of the different organisations in our industry. And as we saw during the pandemic, every person is in a different situation and has different problems to solve. And so actually, I think there is greater awareness that we need to solve these problems together as opposed to just sweeping them under the carpet. Would I say that I'm completely confident that we're a completely disability confident industry these days? 100% no. But at the same time, I think the conversation is becoming more normal and people are less frightened to have the conversation. There's maybe slightly less stigma than there was 10, 20 years ago. And I think that has to be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So as one of the few people in this field with lived experience, living with print disability, how do you think this actually impacts your work in terms of content? So the way that you approach producing accessible content, maybe your interactions with publishers and co-workers, do you think that this particularly, does it have a really transformative effect on the way you approach it? Because obviously I work in accessible publishing as well, without a disability, and it's interesting to me to think about how that might affect your kind of daily perspective on dealing with these things. Because obviously for me, I'm trying to understand people's needs and then how best to serve them. and you have your own to think about as well.
Yeah, and I think you need both, right? You need both people who have lived experience and people who don't. I think the people who don't are very important because actually that's the main audience that we're speaking to. So at the end of the day, if I'm saying something about a screen reader or something about a platform or something about content, and it's not resonating with people who don't have lived experience, then we're probably not going to get the changes that we need. I think there's a few things that come to mind in terms of the lived experience aspect. I think by having lived experience, I hope that I can make this accessibility field a bit more relatable to people. And what I mean by that is, I think it's very easy to other people who have a disability. I've definitely heard lots of times in our industry and elsewhere, well, why should we make medical textbooks accessible? There aren't any disabled doctors. And then I'm in the room and I say, well, hold on, I'm as likely to have surgery as you are, and I would quite like to find out about the surgery that I'm going to have. And they're like, oh yeah, hadn't really thought of that. And I think by representing, if you like, and being able to put that personal perspective, all of a sudden what you're looking at is solving a problem not for an abstract group of people who you can't really relate to, but you're solving a problem for everyday people who you see in the office or on calls. So I think, coming back to the employment thing, I think that's why it's important to have people with disabilities who are employed at all of our companies. But in terms of how it affects the actual work, certainly it really helps me keep the end user in mind because I am an end user, right? So when I'm thinking about readers, when I'm thinking about, okay, so how does this work with a screen reader? I'll try it out with my screen reader, right? And if it doesn't work with my screen reader, then clearly I'll say there's a problem. Or things like color contrast, right? I think you do have to be careful when you have lived experience to understand that your lived experience isn't the same as everybody else's lived experience, right?
Yeah.
My lived experience as a vision impaired person is completely different to, I know you had Stacey Scott on a few weeks ago, right? Her lived experience will be different to mine, which will be different to somebody else who's vision impaired, right? And then obviously it's also important to make sure that you're not just thinking about your disability. So as I said, I'm visually impaired, but we also have to think about people who are hearing impaired or dyslexic or dyspraxic, and they are equally important to people who are visually impaired.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's about relatability. It's also about maybe helping prioritize, thinking about if there's 10 things you could do, okay, what are the biggest pain points here, and how can we go about solving those? So thinking about, for example, when people say to me, why do we need EPUBs? We have tagged PDFs, are they not good enough? And actually it's easier for me to explain maybe the different job that an EPUB does compared to a tagged PDF because I use EPUBs and tagged PDFs. I'm not saying other people couldn't do it, but obviously it's easy for me to relate that to stuff that I interact with on a daily basis. I think also what I would say is when I speak with customers or readers or authors, the people that we work with every day, it shows them that you're taking it seriously. So I think just going back to something I said earlier, one of the big things for me is that I want to change accessibility from a kind of a nice to have bolt on to an integral part of what we do every day. I want to change it from a cost and compliance kind of idea to an investment and opportunity idea. And when I'm speaking to people and say, hey, this affects me every day, actually people sit back and say, hey, actually Elsevier are taking this seriously.
Right.
And I think that's quite powerful. So recently, for example, I was speaking with a librarian and she was asking me, what are we doing for the Americans with Disabilities Act? And I was explaining some of the things that we're doing. And I'm explaining some of the challenges, right? Especially around alt text and AI and this kind of thing. And because I have lived experience, when I was talking about the challenges, she took me a bit more seriously and it sounded less like an excuse and more like a problem to be solved. And I think that's quite important in terms of the relationship between publishers and the people that we serve.
Yeah, absolutely. So you briefly mentioned AI just there. And so I think I've unfortunately had to ask every guest this, but I particularly need to ask you. You mentioned alt text and AI. Obviously, this is as much of a constant topic in your job as it is in mine. This is what everyone asks about at the moment. Where do you stand currently on the use of AI in image description and the different ways it can be employed?
So where I see AI at the moment is AI is a bit like a washing machine. A washing machine will certainly wash your clothes much quicker and probably more effectively than a mangle. But a washing machine won't separate the whites from the colours. It won't know which bits you can put from the washing basket into the machine and which you can hand wash. Essentially, a washing machine can't take decisions for you, right? And I think the great misnomer about AI is wonderful in lots of ways, but AI isn't going to take decisions for you. We've done quite a lot of testing with AI at Elsevier in terms of alt text capability. And what we've seen is that AI is very good at what I'm going to call translating. It's very good at saying what's in front of you. So for photographs or kind of illustrations, it's quite good. We found it's very poor at what I'm going to call interpreting. So say you've got particularly charts and graphs, right, where it can be interpreted a few different ways. AI doesn't really know how to handle that kind of thing at the moment, right? Even in terms of explaining what it's showing. And obviously as a science publisher, we publish a lot of charts and graphs. And I think with AI, whether we're talking about in publishing or elsewhere, AI is a great assistant to human beings, right? But it doesn't replace human beings. I think Microsoft have got it right when they're advertising their Copilot service, right? When they're saying, never start from a blank page again. AI is great for a first draft, but then you need human beings to get involved, to fine-tune it, to edit it, etc. I was listening to a program on the radio the other day about self-driving cars, right? And obviously as a visually impaired person who can't drive, a self-driving car is the holy grail for me.
Right. Yes.
Right? That would be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, the mythical Tesla robotaxi.
Right. Exactly, right? The thing about self-driving cars are, if every car on the road was self-driving, then self-driving cars would be fine because it would be entirely predictable. But the thing about humans is humans make mistakes, right? And therefore human driving is quite unpredictable, as maybe you know if you drive a car. And so where accidents tend to happen with self-driving cars is when a human being does something unpredictable, right? They do a U-turn or they pull out or they brake all of a sudden, etc. And AI can't account for that yet. And I think that's quite a good kind of thought when we're thinking about image descriptions as well. AI is a good start, and certainly when we're having our image descriptions generated by suppliers, we say to them it's fine to start off with AI, but we insist that a human being then supervises that, then edits and refines that before the author sees it, right? At Elsevier, we have a responsible use of AI policy, and what it says is it's fine to use AI for draft material, but it must be edited by a human being before it gets to the final stage. I am not seeing an area right now, to be honest, certainly for something like science publishing and medical publishing in particular, where you need very high levels of accuracy. So I'm thinking about things like dosages, and for where the consequences of inaccuracy could literally be fatal, where we'll ever use AI without a human being. But I think AI has the potential as a great labor-saving device, and also as a great money-saving device. So for example, when I think about things like audio description, so narration for videos, I can well see a scenario where you have AI describing the video and then a human being checks that description before it goes out. So I'm very pro AI in terms of I think it has amazing capabilities to do things at scale that will be way too expensive and time consuming to do manually, but I don't think that it's a magic bullet, and I don't think that it will replace human being intervention or ability. More, I think it allows human beings to demonstrate our value, in terms of our value is in doing the checking and the quality assurance, as opposed to the manual work of the actual inputting in the first place.
Right. Yeah. Don't just shove things in the AI washing machine.
Exactly.
And expect
Yeah,
perfect results.
that's a good summary of what I just said. Yeah.
So if we are talking about the human element of image descriptions in this case, but I think it also goes for any kind of semantic work, where do you think this best sits in the publishing chain? I mean, I often hear people say authors should do them, but then you also hear that authors aren't necessarily trained in writing image descriptions or in identifying other types of semantics. But then, of course, editors aren't at the moment either, but then they don't want the extra work. It seems like this is something everyone agrees should be done somewhere, but no one's quite sure where it should sit. Where do you stand on that one?
Yeah, and I guess I'm going to say this from the perspective, as I said, who's someone who worked in editorial for 10 plus years, as well as somebody who works in accessibility now, right? And for me, the way I think about this is I think the Venn diagram of authors who want to do this and are equipped to do this is actually pretty small. I think there definitely are some authors out there who are really highly skilled and really want to do this, but I don't think that's representative of authors as a whole. I also think that the understanding of alt text, what it is and how it's used, is actually not very well understood amongst the author community. So to give you an example, right? We have currently just been testing as part of our alt text capabilities how authors review alt text. And we did 2 pilots. So we did one where the author reviews the alt text and basically gives comments basically and suggests changes. And the other where the author directly edits the alt text themselves. And we found that in most cases where the author directly edited it themselves, they entirely removed the long description because they didn't understand the difference between a long description and a short description, right? And that isn't particularly criticism of authors. It's basically just saying that even though we sent instructions and we explained, not all authors read the instructions, and actually the skill of writing alt text and understanding what different types of image description are used for is different to the skill you need to write a book. And actually I see the provision of alt text as a value add that publishers can offer, right? Certainly in this era of open access, you get a lot of academics say, what are publishers actually offering these days, right? You know, they're charging the fees, they're making money. What are you offering? And I feel that alt text is a really good example of a value add. Yeah. So that's why what we do is we get suppliers, as I said, to generate the alt text, probably using AI to start with, and then, you know, we make sure that they're using specialists to refine that, and then it gets sent to the authors to review at proof stage. And the reason we do that is because the more images that you write alt text for, the better you're going to be. So actually, an author writing, you know, alt text for a chapter's worth of image, I don't think is going to be as good as a specialist who does this all day, every day, not just for Elsevier, but are doing it for other publishers as well, right? This is a specialist skill, and ideally I want people doing it that it's their job, and that's the area that they really focus on. So for me, the best way forward is really to have the suppliers provide it, and then the authors to review it. I've heard some people suggest it should be the other way around, that the authors should do a draft and then the suppliers should maybe, or copy editors should refine it. But I think the challenge there is, having worked in as an editorial for 10 plus years, and for quite a while it was my job to get a manuscript off an author. Authors are busy people, especially in fields like medicine where we're dealing with, you know, doctors and that kind of thing, right? Actually, to say to them, right, I would like you to write a description for each of the 600 images in your book, isn't really the way to get an on-time manuscript that's going to meet the publication schedule, right? We have to think about how this fits into the publishing schedule, as well as how the publishing program and schedule fits in with accessibility. And that's why, to me, if we go back to value add and AI, like we were talking about before, actually the way that we use authors' value their skill is by getting them to check the alt text that's already there, as opposed to getting them to generate the alt text to begin with, especially when that isn't particularly their specialist skill, remembering that alt text is a technical skill in itself.
Right. So given that most publishers are not going to employ sort of image description teams internally, it therefore makes most sense to outsource that, albeit carefully, to a trusted quality source.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is, right? In the same way that lots of aspects of the production process, like copy editing, etc., are also carefully outsourced these days as well.
Now, there are other accessibility-related tasks that require some knowledge of the text. So I'm thinking about logical ordering, particularly in complex layouts that don't have a linear order but need one for reflowable ebook or other type of HTML view, and semantic tagging, so actual tagging sections within the book so that screen readers and other technology can navigate them properly. So in a similar way to image description, right, this is something that could be seen as a technical task, but actually needs knowledge of the content of the book to do it properly. So do you see those as kind of burgeoning skills for editorial teams to learn, or as also stuff that is best done out of house?
So I think for me, the important thing is that accessibility should be integrated with all the other publishing services we provide, as opposed to thinking about it being somehow other or different to it, right? So in the same way that when you have a copy editor, there need to be a specialist copy editor who understands scientific content if you're working on an Elsevier book, or, art history content if you're working for an art history publisher, right? When we're thinking about these other types of processes and services that you're talking about, of course it's important that these are carried out by people who are specialists. And I think actually part of our job as an industry is to equip people with those skills. So I know, for example, we're going to be talking about PageCon a bit later, and I know that adjacent to that is a workshop that's being run by Ken Jones that will really deal with some of these areas, like, for example, accessibility in InDesign. And I think it's really important that we make sure that the people who are doing these jobs are able to access the skills that they need in order to get the right training. I think, not that I want to be doing anybody out of a job, but I think for me, success for accessibility is that we end up having fewer what I'm going to call accessibility specialists and more people for whom accessibility is just a part of what they do every day, because then accessibility will really be seen as integral to the services and the workflows that we have in publishing, as opposed to either adjacent to it or somehow other to it.
Right. So these kind of tagging and related tasks that are production tasks but require knowledge of the text somehow need to be done from within the publisher themselves. Of course, then there's always the arguments between production and editorial for a task like that is a production task but requires editorial knowledge. How do you think that gets unknotted?
I mean, I think that's one of the classic publishing questions, right? And I think it goes way beyond accessibility. And I think about something like metadata, for example, right? There's obviously accessibility metadata now, stuff like Onyx List 196, but there's lots of different types of metadata, things like promise codes and what have you, that go with a book or indeed a journal. And I think it's probably for each publisher to work out the exact division of labour. Obviously, as an editorial person, I'm going to say the job of editorial is to really make sure that the scope and the idea and the content of the book are clear. And so for books where things are distinct or different, then I would expect editorial to get involved. I would expect production to be really focused on that everything runs smoothly and that workflows are adhered to. So I would expect production to hold editorial to account, that they're giving production all the information they need in order to do a good job. But I'm sure, Simon, as a former production person, you may have a slightly different view on that to me.
No, not at all. I think that communication between the two and making sure that everybody sees accessibility as their job, and that those conversations, it's not always going to fall neatly on one side or the other with any particular type of task, right? And that goes for technology as well, that there are, particularly with this space, there are problems that are simultaneously technical, workflow and production, and editorial type problems that everyone really has to collaborate in order to be able to solve. So for any particular publisher, that system might look a different way, right? The process might need to be architected differently. But broadly speaking, it's about everybody saying, rather than that's not my problem, everyone's saying, here's what I can contribute to solving it.
Totally, right. And I think when, just going back to accessibility for a second, I spoke earlier on about wanting to change the narrative from a cost and compliance one to an investment and opportunity one. And I think part of that is really changing that discussion from what do we have to do to what could we do. Because actually, when we're thinking about accessibility, images without text, for example, score better on SEO platforms like Google, so they're more discoverable. And actually, one of the things that I think we really need to do as accessibility enthusiasts, or campaigners, shall I say, is really think about how accessibility can help publishers meet their business goals, whether that's impact goals or commercial goals or whatever it is for an individual publisher. And so similarly, when we're thinking about how accessibility integrates into publishing workflows, it's important that we see this as actually we're helping create a great book that more people are going to want and to be able to read, and it's going to perform better, whether that's usage or sales, etc., as opposed to, okay, what do we have to do for this annoying law, right? And I think a lot of the kinds of work that people like you and I and lots of other people in the industry do, I think is really changing the narrative around that.
Yeah. No, I mean, to that end, I often say to publishers that when you're making your content accessible, you're, broadly speaking, enriching your content. You're making it more semantically rich. You're making it better structured. And that has other benefits, right? That makes the content much easier to transform. So if there's a format change in the future, you've got more to work with when all this semantic information is in there. Machine readability kind of has all kinds of benefits, particularly as we're now seeing different ideas about how we could interrogate content, how AI could interface with content in useful ways rather than just the scary ones. And all of this benefits from better structured, better produced content. And it kind of begins to make the digital version, rather than just an output, almost makes it the canonical output, right, that everything else can flow from.
Yeah, agreed.
So I suppose this is something that you and I will harp on about in our attempts to make everybody take this seriously. What are some other approaches that you've found effective when you're trying to get people who aren't disabled to really care about accessibility and care about incorporating what are very often expensive and disruptive changes to deeply entrenched ways of working?
I think obviously it depends on your organization, right? So clearly most organizations will have a mission, and aligning accessibility with the organization's mission, but also, as I said, to their business goals, really helps. I think when you can create a win-win scenario, right? So it's, you have to do this to help me, but actually we can do this and this is going to help you achieve what you want to achieve. I think that's the sweet spot really where you get a win. So, whether we're talking about accessibility or we're talking about disability inclusion, I think actually the principles here are the same. So, for example, if I go to Elsevier's head of recruitment and say, do you want to increase your candidate pool by 15%? Yes, I definitely do. Right, well, this is
Yeah.
what you've got to do, right?
Right.
Instead of saying to him, well, I think it's really bad that, you don't have any disabled candidates. I have no idea if they actually have any disabled candidates or not, but instead of, castigating them, it's actually helping them achieve their goals. And similarly,
Right.
when I'm thinking about accessibility, you talked about AI before. Certainly for Elsevier, AI innovation is a big priority for us, right? As I know it is for lots of companies. And therefore, to say to senior leadership, hey, instead of thinking about accessibility as a compliance thing, let's think about it as a tool for innovation where you can really road test a lot of these AI capabilities. Or, for example, if we're thinking about submissions through our journal platform, if we wanted to grow the amount of authors that submit to us every year, actually we say to them, okay, well, if we make our platform more accessible, it means that more people will be able to submit, and that will be great for us and where we're trying to go as a company, right? And so I think for me, it's about thinking not about me and what I want. As I said, I'm a campaigner, I want everything to be accessible. That's what my career is about, but really about my audience and thinking about what their goals are, right? Whether it's short term or long term. And really, instead of thinking about what's my job, but just like you said, how can I contribute to them achieving their goals in a way that furthers the cause that I'm trying to further.
Right. So one of the things that you've alluded to there, I often hear people talk about wider markets, whether that's in terms of contributors or indeed in terms of sales. I'm always very hesitant to talk about potential sales increases just because anybody in sales or executives are going to ask for projections for something like that, right? They're going to say, increase sales by how much? And of course, it's something we don't know. It's something we can't know. Just as you can't know that somebody didn't purchase your content because they could see from metadata or from reviews or whatever that it was lacking some crucial feature that didn't serve their needs. Well, they won't buy it. You won't know that they didn't. You won't know that they reviewed it and decided against it. So it must be all kinds of lost sales that nobody ever knows about, just as you won't necessarily know that a particular measure you put in is the reason why somebody bought something. How would you approach talking about this very likely true sales advantage of accessibility that's in fact very hard to quantify?
I think everybody wants to grow their audience, right? And I think a lot of this is about how people feel. I do think that, right? So, as I said, you can either take the compliance route in terms of this is what we have to do, or we can take the kind of this is what we could do innovation route, right? Clearly, in terms of sales, we can't say, right, well, if you do this, then you're going to guarantee get X return. But I would also say that if I brought to you a marketing campaign that reached 15% more customers than you had today, you'd probably be pretty interested in it as a marketing director or a sales director. And I would also say, the nature of sales is that nothing is a guarantee, right? Clearly, whatever way you try to market your products, you can't guarantee that people are going to buy them. But certainly, we can say, well, if we don't do this, we can guarantee people won't buy them. But actually, if we go back to the mission thing again, our mission is to try and make sure that the research we publish is in the hands of as many people as possible. And actually, part of that is making sure that everybody is able to read and to access the research that we're publishing. And from that point of view, I'd say that accessibility is a pretty compelling argument.
Right. And connected to that, I sometimes come across this attitude that, okay, but if that's the case, people will maybe go through a charity or use a specialist service or a specialist library, etc. And of course, the response to that is always that, no, in fact, probably most disabled people are not using some pre-described service, but are self-treating, right? A lot of people are not diagnosed. A lot of people may not even consider themselves disabled, but are simply using tools that they come across in their life to make things easier for themselves. I often think about the huge number of people that use closed captions when they're watching video that don't think of that as an accessibility feature as such.
Right.
It's just, but actually maybe they're hard of hearing, or maybe they don't even realize that they are. Do you think this self-treatment thing is as common as I suspect?
I think possibly. I think you touch on quite an important point here, which is the best accessibility tools and the ones that have the most impact we don't think about as accessibility tools. So, for example, the remote control for a TV was developed to help people who had mobility issues, right, and couldn't go up to the TV and change channels.
Huh.
Or, for example, the home button on a phone was developed for people who had difficulty manipulating the touchscreen, right? Or Siri, for example, was developed for the same reasons. Now, these are not things that we think of as accessibility tools. They're just things that we all use. And similarly, I read some research recently that 70% of young people, so I think, sadly for you and I, Simon, I think they mean under 30, watch video at least once a week with no sound. And that's because they're in areas maybe where they don't have any privacy, public spaces, etc., etc. Or perhaps they prefer to process the written word over the spoken word. So, for example, if you're, say, English isn't your first language and you're watching a video of someone speaking English, it might be easier for you to process that with captions than it is, listening to them. And so the way that I think about accessibility is clearly, whilst there's always going to be some very bespoke accessibility tools, so as I mentioned, I use a screen reader, there's also many tools out there, again, going back to this idea of accessibility at its best, being integrated with everyday life rather than separate from it. The accessibility features are just things that everybody uses, right? So I was speaking to somebody recently and they'd sort of by accident discovered the audio description feature on their TV and they'd started using it. They're not visually impaired at all, but they said, this is great. I'm able to, do something else as I'm watching this film.
Yeah,
and
great when
I
you're
feel
doing
like
the dishes.
I'm not missing out. Exactly.
Yeah.
Doing the dishes or doing the ironing or whatever it is, right? And so I think when we're thinking about accessibility features, certainly when we're thinking about commercially, yes, disability inclusion is part of this, but I think it goes beyond that as well, actually just as a user feature that people like and is going to make for a better user experience for everybody.
Yeah. I get really fired up by this idea. It's in the same way that we've all gotten used to talking about neurodivergence now, and about how really what we're talking about is the spectrum of human need and human preference and the spectrum of human experience, and just rather than trying to rigidly define the correct way of consuming or engaging with something, right? Just saying, actually, people have this vast range of different needs and preferences that are all equally valid. And indeed that we're not, I think a lot of people think we're just talking about blindness when we talk about accessibility for publishing, but we're talking about so many different things and so many different types of ways of processing information. And of course, the work that we do in this field is all just trying to allow people to best serve their own preferred ways of taking information on, right? It makes it a very grand mission.
So I listened to a webinar recently from NISO, so I'll give NISO a shout out here, where George Kershaw was presenting, and I'm sure you're very familiar with George and his work.
Big fan.
Yeah, right. That more people have accessibility needs than are left-handed. And I thought that was amazing.
Wow.
Right? That really kind of resonated with me, right? And I think that visually impaired people are, I'm not going to say visually impaired people aren't important. I am one. But I think because maybe our disability is the most obviously linked to publishing because it's about text and the inability to access text, I think it's quite easy for us to be the squeaky wheel. But actually, as I said before, when you think about things like dyslexia and dyspraxia and hearing impaired people, you're coming across a really large group of people here.
Right.
And actually, when we're thinking about the collective knowledge and brain power of this cohort, actually, as a human race, if we're not harnessing that in terms of access to knowledge and access to learning, I think we're really doing ourselves quite a disservice as a species.
Yeah, I think this is it's a beautiful way of thinking about it. The way that you describe this, really, it's a good demonstration of something that I was talking about on LinkedIn recently that a lot of people kindly reposted, that if you were to draw a Venn diagram of people who work in publishing, in accessibility within this space, and lovely human beings, you pretty much end up with a circle, right? It seems to attract a very nice sort of person. Is this your experience as well? Because, I mean, to me, this is one of the best parts of our industry, that it's people like you, that it's very lovely people that decide to work in this, right? It's not generally something people go into because they're chasing fame or fortune.
I mean, it'd be a bit awkward if I said no at this point, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you're right. Let the witness a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reason is because, as you mentioned, by its nature, accessibility is very collaborative and very cogent in terms of it's quite mission driven, right? And if you're the kind of person who is quite mission driven and who maybe has a sense of kind of social justice and you believe in collaboration, it's going to attract a certain sort of person. I think, slightly controversially, I'd maybe have a bit of a health warning here in that when we talk about diversity and the importance of diversity and diverse perspectives, actually I think it's really important that within the accessibility space and elsewhere, that we make sure that we still have room for, robust discussion and frank exchange of ideas. And actually, one thing that I think we do quite well in the accessibility space, and I'm thinking about people like my good friends Bill Castorf and Richard Orme, right? We quite often have, differences of opinion, right? It doesn't mean that there's wrong or right, but it's about really making sure that in order for this industry to move forward, we are challenging each other, respectfully challenging each other, but continue to challenge each other. And so what I'd say is, yes, I would agree with you. Everybody's very nice. Everybody's very cooperative. But we also need to make sure that we don't let that niceness get in the way of innovation and really being able to deliver the best quality of accessibility that we can for the most amount of people. Because actually, in order to have great ideas, you need to have disagreements sometimes as well, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes me think of a comment thread on a Scholarly Kitchen article where yourself and some others were debating interpretation of something in the European Accessibility Act, and that sort of discussion where people were disagreeing with each other and sparring over it ended up as incredibly useful, certainly in my understanding of that particular issue. So I think you're quite right that the respectful jousting like that can end up producing some of the best ideas. I mean, why have humans cultivated debate as an activity for so long in the first place?
So, and I think one of the things I think we need to guard against, and I'm not talking about accessibility now, I'm more thinking about the kind of digital publishing space in its loosest sense, right? So thinking about, Twitter and kind of everything beyond, is we need to not be afraid of being wrong, right? So if we think about, for example, you mentioned a Scholarly Kitchen article, and I suspect I remember the Scholarly Kitchen article, and one of the areas that we were debating on is about the backlist, right? So previously published material, about whether that was in scope or not. And I thought it wasn't in scope, and other people thought it was.
It was about the grace
period, whether the grace period applied to us. And because we had that conversation, that made me go and get extra legal advice. And I realised that I wasn't right? That actually my interpretation wasn't the right interpretation. And that's okay, There's nothing wrong with being wrong and accepting you're wrong and learning from it and moving on, right? Because that's how we all learn. And I think one of the challenges, in today's society, as it were, is I think people do worry about, well, someone might think I was wrong. Well, actually, I hope I'm wrong often and all the time, because if I keep being wrong, I'll keep learning. And actually, why are we in this publishing space if it's not because we like learning?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a quote that Penn Jillette used to use, but no one could quite work out where it had originated. He was determined that it wasn't him. Saying it like he's dead. Penn Jillette's alive as far as I know. But he said that to be an intellectual is to be somebody willing to change your opinion when presented with new information. Something along those lines. It's a really minimal definition of an intellectual. That's all. Just information is what makes you change your opinion, not dogma.
Exactly, right? And I think one of the exciting things about working in accessibility is that it's quite a fast-moving, innovative space, right? There's a lot new happening all the time. And so I would say that if we as an industry are really going to get the hang of this accessibility business, I think flexibility is going to be one of the most important qualities that we're going to have to really embrace, and just accept that what good looked like 5 years ago might not be what good looks like today, and also be prepared to have these conversations and be prepared to change our views, both about what good looks like, but also in terms of maybe what our priorities are or what the market needs, etc., etc. You spoke about AI earlier, and I look at these as opportunities, right? Opportunities not to change the principles of what we do, but really innovate the methods of how we do them and challenge our views on the best way of going about things. So to give you an example, right, you talked about authors writing out text as another example. Right now, my view is that the best way to do this is using suppliers. But let's say in the future, could I imagine a scenario where AI gets a lot better and we have a AI tool built into a submission system that automatically generates out text and then the author edits it? Yeah, I can. And then you get the best of both worlds. We're not there yet, but we have to be flexible with our approach depending on the information we have.
Right. And you may have half answered my final question there, as we do approach the top of the hour. It's a question that scares me a little bit, and in fact, I've had some people don't really want to answer, which is right now because of particularly the European Accessibility Act. There is this big emphasis on accessibility, and budgets are available, and people are paying attention. So obviously, there are accessibility professionals like you and I, and many others, who are working in this space. How do you see these types of roles evolving after the EAA comes into force and similar legislation becomes more normalized around the world? Obviously, there's lots of similar legislation in other territories. How do you see accessibility roles evolving when it's not the big rush that it is right now?
I'm going to answer this in the same way as I answered a question about our disability staff network in, I think, the second meeting. Somebody said to me, what does success look like for the disability staff network? And I said, well, success
no
is
job for you, aren't you?
Success is that we don't have to have a disability staff network because disability inclusion is so integrated into not just this organisation but into society in general. But I think we're a long way from that. And I think similarly with accessibility, clearly it will be amazing if accessibility was so integrated and hardwired into everything we did that the term accessibility was no more relevant than the term something like secretary or something is today, right? I think that's quite a long way. And I think if we look at the legislation coming out of the EU, but also coming out of the US, I think two things about those legislations. First of all, it's going to take quite a lot from all publishers, I think, in order to comply with them. But second of all, they are just the start. They're by no means comprehensive of everything that a publisher does. And so I think that these accessibility specialist roles, however you want to describe them, are going to be in demand, for the foreseeable future. I think what I would say is that really, at its best, accessibility is part of user experience, right? Whether we're talking about how people use content or how people use platforms or products. And so in the future, I can well see accessibility being part of those kinds of organizations, with the understanding that as technology evolves, accessibility considerations will also need to evolve. So, for example, just coming back to our favorite topic, AI, right now AI is in a certain place and can do certain things, but actually in the future it may well be all different, and we will need to think about how disabled people can interact with those new developments in the same way as everybody else. One of my friends who is, I would say, an expert in data-driven EDI innovation, said to me recently, she said, at the moment we have the tech bro version of AI, right? Think about who's developing it and why they're developing it. And therefore, as we move AI forward, we need to consciously make sure that it's inclusive. And actually, I see accessibility specialists as inclusion agents in that way. And so I'm not too concerned about the future, but going back to that theme of flexibility, I think we will need to change and evolve just as the industry and just as technology does.
I love it. That's a perfect end. So I will allow you to return to your evening, but honestly could do this ad infinitum. For people who want to follow your journey or get in touch with you about something, what will be the best way for people to speak to you?
Find me on LinkedIn is probably the best way. So you can look me up. My name is Simon Holt. Should be quite easy to locate, I think. I am one of the rare people who doesn't have a Twitter account, and I must say my life is much more peaceful as a result, so I don't think that's going to change in the near future.
Yes, fair. Simon, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Before we sign off, I'm just going to talk about a few events, at least one of which I know for a fact that you're going to be at because we've already talked about it. First of all, coming up on Tuesday the 17th of September is the IPG Autumn Conference, Independent Publishers Guild. And I'm going to be there talking about the do's and don'ts of use of AI in digital production. So obviously a topic that we've touched on here today and that we've touched on in previous episodes of the podcast. So I do highly recommend that people check that event out. If you Google IPG Autumn Conference, it comes up right at the top. And the other event that you alluded to earlier was the first ever PageCon, PAAG. So this is our summer school conference event being run by the Publishing Accessibility Action Group. And this is running on September the 19th and 20th. So we have an overnight. It's going to be a ton of fun. You'll find Simon and I at the bar drinking very small amounts and reacting to it far too much. It should be a really fun couple of days away. And I'll be giving talks on building a business case and on accessible workflows, on building accessibility into your workflows. And Simon, you'll be participating in PageCon as well.
That's right. So I will be involved in the case study session, and colleagues at Elsevier will be involved in talking about the backlist and also talking about end user engagement. So really looking forward to all of those sessions.
Fantastic. So yeah, please do check out PageCon 2024. Tickets are on sale now, but they won't be for a huge amount longer. So please do take a look. I've got a couple of other events that will be coming up, but I will talk about those another time. Of course, it is conference season, so there's an awful lot going on right now. Thank you again, Simon, for joining me for this episode of the Digital Publishing Podcast, and we'll see you again in the future.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.